Good morning. Today I'm going to be talking about Year 11 or Preliminary Engineering Studies, or HSC Engineering Studies. And last time I said that I was going to go through the scope of the profession, which we've done, and then the historical and social influences. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm pretty much going to be reading off Copeland's textbook for this. We've discussed these things when we talked about innovations right at the start, and unfortunately, I don't have those slides on me. So I'd be clicking on a video, which is probably not ideal. So what I'm going to be doing is like I said, using Copeland's textbook. So this is Paul Copeland's Engineering Studies: The Definitive Guide. This is Volume 1. Because we're doing what are we doing? We're doing the Year 11 textbooks. So let me just get stuff ready. Sorry, just 1 second. Just getting the textbook ready. I thought I had it open, but I didn't. Okay. So just to give the context, I'm not going to show the book on the screen, but I'm going to give some context. So we have Chapter 4, Biomedical Engineering, and we've gone through this section here, and we're now getting to historical and societal influences. Going from Copeland's book, so he mentions that it's existed for many years. There were articulated limbs were being made in the 1500s. So an articulated limb means that it's not just a solid stick that's being attached to someone. It's not just a peg or a hook. It's something that's got a joint. Most products were wooden, but though metal was sometimes used. We've talked about how the Roman capua leg is the oldest prosthetic that we're aware of, and that's 2,500 years old, or 2,300 years old. But there's almost certainly wooden prostheses that were used prior to that. There were leather-covered non-functional hands, so just aesthetics. There was not until World War I that biomedical engineering started to grow. After World War II, the field grew even further. There was some use of plastics. They became less obtrusive. Okay, so now we use myoelectric limbs. I'll get that word up for you. Myoelectric. So myoelectric is the term for the electrical properties of muscles. So your brain controls, just something I'll mention again is, okay. So this course, it sounds maybe, I don't know if they necessarily brand themselves very well, but this is something that I've listened to. I've listened to this series of lectures. So it's 24 lectures. Each of them is about, I think, half an hour, something like that. And I found them to be quite good. There's also documents that go with it, and they talk about how our brain perceives the world, and how our brain. So if we think about in the control system world, we talk about sensors. So sensors are how we perceive the world, and then we have actuators, which are what actually does things. So those are motors or servos, those sorts of things, things that turn or pull or twist. And for humans, so we have senses is all about that perception. Of course, goes into a lot of detail, talking about how we have cells that, when different kinds of electricity or disruption touches that cell, it causes an electric shock to be sent to your brain. So when you see light, photons hit sensors, cells that are receptive to photons at the back of your eye, and depending on which part of the back of your eye, that will send a signal to your brain, and your brain will decode that signal, and that's how we see things. For touch, we have cells in our fingers that perceive pressure, and when those cells are squashed, or when pressure is applied to those cells, electrical impulses are sent to the brain decodes that as touch. For the reverse, for actuation, for actually doing things, what our brain does is it sends electrical signals down nerves to tighten muscles, and when it tightens the muscles, like a puppet, that will cause a contraction. And so all of our movement is done through contraction of muscles. It's never done from in order to move your hand one way, you contract the muscle. Say, let's say I want to fold my hand, let's say I want to do a queen wave. What I'm doing is I would contract the muscles to the left-hand side and then to the right-hand side. And by contracting the muscles, pulling on different strings, it causes my hand to move. So myoelectric is the term for electrical properties of muscles. Anyway, so we started to see after World War II a very small amount of myoelectric prosthetics. If someone reminds me in the chat, I will post some links to that great courses on our group chat. Should remind me to open the chat. View doc chat. It's here somewhere. Oh, there it is. Okay. So where were we? Biomedical engineering covers the replacement of also covers internal body joints. So we have artificial hips, which were first developed in 1960. Metal ball fitted into a plastic socket, providing a reliable hip joint. Newer joints allow the bone to grow into the joint and makes them stronger, and you don't need to nail or screw the attachment. In 1961, the first artificial heart valve was fitted. Prior to this, pig heart valves were being used. Although this caused damage to the blood, it was this option, or perhaps death of the user, that design. Newer valves used titanium with a flap for opening and closing. In 1978, the first human was fitted with a cochlear implant. We watched a video about the Australian Graham Clark. I don't know if he was Australian of the Year, but he definitely Order of Australia. And in 1982, the design was commercialized, allowing deaf people to hear. We've talked about how, in terms of relations with the community, that's generally pretty positive, with the exception of the deaf community, who are not necessarily fans of things like cochlear implants. I did have some, I guess if someone reminds me in Zoom, in my other video I talk about like the loss of the Irish language as an example of language loss, and where that the relationship to that. When I had my one of my Zoom lessons recently, I talked about being able to tell the difference between Klingon and Irish, but I'll save that for Zoom lessons. Just if you weren't in that class, let me know and remind me. Okay, over 20,000 people have had bionic ears, and half of those are children who won't ever learn sign language. Often don't learn sign language. Okay. The artificial heart was developed over years, and it was it had a lot of bad publicity in the 80s, but it came back with a lot of improvements. They talk a little bit about the company Ventricator in the textbook and how they went into liquidation. They went bankrupt in 2009. It's interesting to point out that there is a lot of risk. So when we talk about people like the EpiPens multiplying their price by 6 times when their competitor went bankrupt, it is worth mentioning that there's a lot of risk in biomedical innovation, and there's a lot of hurdles that have to be jumped. And even though there's this benefit to humanity, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to make money from it. Okay, so we go through the specific example of the total artificial heart. It so first of all, it talks about why is this relevant. Well, a total heart disease is one of the leading killers. I don't know if it's the leading killer. It is the single. It says in the book the single largest cause of death in Australia. So as in 1997, the statistic used, 30,000 Australians a year die. Every day, around 80 Australians die from heart disease. Okay. In 1964, the US government funded a project to develop an artificial heart. In 69, the Lyotta total artificial heart. Okay, so this was the one used in 69. Was used as a bridge between the need for transplant and... So while you were waiting on a transplant, you could use this Lyotta. In 81, the Akatsu total artificial heart was developed. So this is in 81. Akatsu. Okay. And in 82, Barney Clark was the first person fitted with a Jarvik 7. Which looked like that. I used to have a picture of that on the wall, but I don't know. I think the new one I have now looks better. I don't always have the earliest version of things. Like when I have radiotherapy, I don't have the first radiotherapy machine. In 85, Phoenix TAH was used as a bridge between transplants, but only to have the patient die 12 hours after the transplant. In 2000, Biomed released a new hydroelectric plant heart. So Biomed. So this is the one that I have up on the wall. I think I specifically have that picture. And by 2012, 4 patients had received AbioCore, one living a healthy life for 17 months. None died due to the failure of the heart. Okay, so the advantage of the AbioCore is it uses a polyester-based polyurethane called AngioFlex. I think angio is Latin for some aspect of the heart. Oh, ease or comfort. Okay. And titanium alloys. Well, power comes from a lithium battery mounted in the torso. This feature separates AbioCore from other hearts because it can be it has a control unit. So it means that the user should be able to lead a normal life. Previous pneumatic hearts meant that the user was connected to a compressor. To supplement the limited internal battery life, a battery pack can be worn, which connects to the internal circuitry via induction coils. So you don't want to have too many things sticking out of your body because they provide points for infection. It says here, it negates the need for the skin to be broken, thus reducing the chance of infection. Exactly. We agree there. Okay, AbioCore is an important development for many people who suffer chronic heart disease. It helps them to live a somewhat better life than previous total artificial hearts. 4 people have been implanted with AbioCore and extended their life by 17 months. Okay, the effect of biomedical engineering on people's lives. Prior to 1960, a failed heart valve meant certain death. A failed hip joint meant the person was probably confined to a wheelchair and in a lot of pain. Wheelchair being the best case scenario. They're probably confined to a bed. Continued developments in biomedical engineering are opening up new options. The development of the cochlear implant has enabled people to hear again. This offers immense benefits for people in areas communicating with humans, safety in the workplace, and entertainment. So one of the arguments against the deaf community's argument that their language is being killed out and that that's a bad thing is that there's just a safety consideration. Now, to work on the railways, for example, you have to pass a hearing test. And if my wife wasn't in earshot, I would talk about how I was really worried about failing that test because my wife tells me I have the TV up too loud. And then when I took that test, I asked them, how did I go? And they said, oh, you're like way up in the 90, well over the 95th percentile. So, yeah. Anyway. But you probably aren't going to get onto the working on the rail corridor with a cochlear implant anyway. But as we get better and better, that will help. But it is important that safety in just the ordinary day-to-day life, in terms of driving, being able to hear the sound of the vehicle, all these little things that we take for granted, which drastically improve our safety, which you don't have if you're completely deaf or if you have significant hearing impairment. Okay, so going back to the thing, advances communicating with others and entertainment. So it's not always, in terms of entertainment, I mean, obviously, there are people who sign music. What was his name? Niles. So this is a woman who is doing a interpreter exam. And, yeah. Anyway, so the idea is that there are people who do interpret concerts, and that deaf people can still enjoy just the rhythm of the music, and having someone sign with enthusiasm that follows the spirit of the music can help deaf people. But they're obviously still missing out on the melody of the song itself if you're deaf. So that's an element of entertainment that is lost by people who don't get cochlear implants. Don't dox me, deaf community. I lost where I was. Okay, so it's much harder to make so we have an artificial ear, right? But much harder to make an artificial eye. But Copeland's talking about how that would be a big advantage. The importance of the total. They've already discussed the advantage of the total artificial heart. Okay. Biomedical engineering is also responsible for precision design of equipment used in surgical procedures, and medical surveillance or diagnostics, monitoring, and imagery. So, for instance, the development of heart monitors, beep, or EKGs, various scanners. So, for instance, CAT scanners, MRIs, nuclear cameras. So we watch people swallowing barium. And surgical equipment like laparoscopic surgery. All of these things, they either improve accuracy of surgery, they reduce the chance of infection, they help us to identify the problem. So my brother was saying that when he worked in a rural hospital, just the importance of CT or CAT scanners in order to be able to detect a stroke is huge. Because if you have to drive 30 minutes to the nearest hospital to get, if you have to go to the second next hospital to get a CAT scan just for them to confirm you do have a stroke, it's irreversible damage is being done at that time. And even now, cruise ships will have CT scanners so that they can identify quickly that someone has had a stroke. Okay, so we've gone through the book. Let's have a look at what we've just discussed. Okay, so we've talked about the historical background. So we've talked about how prosthetics have existed for thousands of years, how 500 years ago the first articulated joints came about. So things with bends. Okay, and then more recent developments post-World War II and into the modern era. We've talked about various developments. So we've talked about the effect of people's lives. So safety, their ability to work. So there's an economic aspect and a social aspect of being able to work, and the social benefits of things like mobility, so being able to walk and go for exercise, go hiking, and being able to enjoy a concert, for example, are all benefits. Okay, so discuss and relate the historical development of materials that are used in biomedical engineering. Okay, so I'm going to set specific questions on this as homework, but we're going to talk about what materials were used in the you can look at the case study of artificial hearts and compare the innovation of materials. So if we go back to Copeland's book here, what can we see? Well, for artificial hearts, what we have is that first development of artificial hearts was in 64. In 69, the Lyoto heart would allow people to have a few hours of before they waited for a transplant. The Akatsu, you could survive for 9 days after the transplant. So this is in terms of how long you had a longer time before you were waiting for that motorcycle rider to donate you the heart. Okay. And then the Jarvik 7, and then the Phoenix hearts. We probably won't focus too much on Biomed, and then Biocore. So, did they talk about materials in the Biomed? Okay, so Biomed is released by Biocore is released by Biomed. There we go. Just looking at the specific materials. So it uses a AngioFlex, which we talked about. It uses titanium alloys as the materials. I just wanted to look at the development materials. I thought they mentioned that somewhere else. I thought that went into more detail, but I'll live with it. Okay, so what we'll talk about instead is we'll talk about, for prosthetic limbs, we can say that initially you would have had a wooden leg, and the idea of and it's worth pointing out that I think that if we look at here, short history of prosthetics, so here we have a Civil War, a wooden leg from the Civil War, but there would be communities where this is still, so I mentioned before that Cambodia has a huge number of amputees because of landmines. And we talked also about Angola, how their main road, 500 kilometers of road had to be rebuilt because it was so heavily landmined. It was just cheaper to build a new road than it was to build, than it was to clear the landmines. So just because of poverty, that if timber is what you have available, then that's what you use. So okay, so I think that is a wooden prosthetic. Then in Roman times, we talk about the Roman Capua leg. I'll just show that again. Which is made out of bronze, which just with the advantage of that, we know that exists because the wooden legs would have rotted. And then moving on to articulated legs, which we saw before, they're probably made out of steel. Steel is a lot easier to work reliably, giving that reliable movement. Then we looked at polymers. So polymers used after World War II for people with prosthetics. And then we look these days at carbon fiber. So carbon fiber is I would say the more commonly used material for prosthetics. It's worth talking about another influence on the design of our prosthetics is sport. So the Paralympic Games have they put more focus, more attention. So countries were willing to fund research because countries are willing to spend money for gold medals, and this is a way of getting gold medals. So developing these legs helped people, and I think that these days people with prosthetic legs can actually outrun people without prosthetic legs because of the advantage of the materials these days. If you watch that Catalyst video, there's a guy, he has a soft tissue, like it's the same texture as, or it has the same elastic properties as skin. So that okay, so and these days soft robotics is becoming software robotics is a term that people use for when you want a meat-like or a natural flesh texture, and that's a growth area in the field of robotics and especially in biomedical innovation. Okay, so discuss the impact. We've done that. I'm going to set that for homework, and we've discussed the historical development. Okay, pretty happy with where we got there. So in terms of orders of levers, this is not going to be that video. I have already set homework for materials for forging, casting. So this is just me now talking about what homework I'm going to set for people, I think. Yeah, and I can do that offline. So just if you're watching this, I'll stay on the chat for a little bit, but at the moment, the rest of this lesson, I'm just going to spend. We've covered this topic, and I can set the work that we're going to do tomorrow. I will be going through. We have already done orders of levers. I think that's fair to tick that off, but I'll maybe wait until I have a Zoom lesson before I do that. What we probably want to do is we might actually go through the bike question as a separate video. I might do that, try and do that tomorrow, and I might set some homework on polymers. I might, as a separate video, record, because I've got this as a heading, I might record this one now, and then I'll set that for homework. So, okay.